on existentialism, an attempt at an exhibition um, of an avenue of invasion into this freezer box on top of the refrigerator. So it's not totally clear to me what this Kostin Vlad Alamaru thesis wants to argue, but I just make a example or paradigm in order to show what this so-called avenue of invasion that would exhibit existentialism with a reading of the thesis, a simple reading of the thesis, which I put on one side what Strauss says in somewhere deep in the book, like page 90 or something, in Natural Right and History, where he says nomos and physis arose, how does he say, coevally with philosophy itself. So this really means as conscious ideas which were given something like an orientation or definition, these two things started becoming distinct, and then when we point back prior to that, we don't have those two ideas. Instead, Strauss looks for something more mysterious. Like he says this about Antigone, for instance, like that we can't just say this is a question of the so-called natural right, because that would be totally to impose our ideas on a different time. Like, in other words, that it was a customary ancient thing that not to bury her brother was some kind of sacrilege or profane act that couldn't be accepted. We could explain that by calling it natural right, but then we'd be superimposing the current idea. In the same way, if the way he's operating is he's superimposing current concepts on, not on the, so he says, okay, we have the philosophic moment when nomos and physis are distinguished and start to be given special, he calls it abstract, as though what else would there be once we start talking about this type of things. But I guess, so the idea seems to be he's looking at the usage, so like in Pindar, of these terms, and then he keeps grafting back the current, superimposing, illustrating to himself what he's talking about with with terms like physical, and linking it to body and saying, oh, but the Greeks had the word soma, but nonetheless physis meant body, and here's a bunch of things in Pindar that sort of kind of point in that direction. So I think this is like what Agamben says when he quotes Heidegger. So we're kind of deeper in the freezer now, looking at some, I don't know, a package of frozen raspberries or something, and then Agamben says this is like sharpening knives when there's nothing left to be cut. So we're just doing this thing Deleuze and Guattari show in their last book of taking one paradigm or set of concepts and the way of moving, and so this is a way of saying, talking about the physical in the current Dasein, and then saying, oh, and these people must have meant exactly the same thing, even though they didn't even yet have the word fusus until sometime in the Homeric time or so. Um, Actually, that's another point. He's trying to say, here's the things we have extant in the text, but then he's supposing he could project back into sort of daily usage and what daily usage really meant, rather than the perversions of the philosophers. So this is all um, yeah, that's like total wilderness, and you hear the beautiful sound of the bugs at night and so on, and it's a chill in the air, and I don't know, you notice some animals stirring somewhere or something in the night sky, but it's not really anything we could know too clearly, because there's so many um, things open here, and the only thing that makes it seem clear is if we claim that the way things are experienced right now was already under discussion at that time, and that the words just sort of are synonyms. So again, like Schleiermacher said, we never actually can translate ancient Greek texts, because what we do is we take our language and we stretch it into the text, and then say this is what it meant. So we never get there. So that's the once you start with the view that everyone's a child of their own time and carrying their concepts, or this sort of frozen raspberries or something out of their refrigerator onto the counter or wherever, or maybe preparing in the stoves for some kind of flamboy. Uh, you shuffle to that freezer with your concepts, and then you shovel out into the sunny yellow summer, and you're always in this mixture of your time and some projection or something like that. That's in the same way language carries us in such a way that we can sort of construct it that way. And probably, in my opinion, the German language mostly doesn't exist anymore, because the language has been carried back and forth so much between English and German until the words have been made somehow to mean the same thing. So, like, for instance, the several words for scholar, for Wissenschaftler, which doesn't mean scientist but now means scientist, for intellectual, and so on, have all become as much blurred in general German usage as they are in English usage. And then you say, well, how could you prove that? But just listen to Leo Strauss talk in his seminar course from the 60s. He was alive when the old way of thinking was still obvious, and still he took for granted these things, that they're obvious, these kind of distinctions in a way. So that's a direct example when you see Strauss saying, oh, everybody makes a distinction between intellectuals and scholars, which everybody doesn't today, but they did in Prussia when he was a young man. So this thesis is just unaware of the sort of difficulty of the sharpening of the knives when there's nothing left to be cut, in this sense, because we're not really we can't really persuade ourselves that we've got back to how people were thinking before they started fooling around with the concepts and adding artificial content and then transferring that to the next generation in such a way that we would then see how things stood before diffusus and nomos became known terms. So this is the reason why, also on a side, I'd say Sanskrit is of a ludicrous amount of interest for this subject because it's a totally hieratic language. It's a totally consciously built language, and the whole thing is the people who are thinking, giving words usage, and then passing it on and actually creating the whole language out of it. There's a pre-existing language, Praktik, something like that. I forget how to say it, but I think it still exists. But so there's something like what we could just conceptually, um, though it leads to the same kind of errors, say something in order to point to it. The distinction between a motor response type of language, which is mostly practical and having to do with everyday tasks, and an intellectual language, which is full of so-called abstraction when that contrast is made, when the contrast is made in that way. As Carl Jung made it, for instance, in his first published book on some kind of responses to stimulus words, with some of in the more simple language of the Swiss peasants and some in the educated language, and the various responses of different subjects to that. Anything like that is then going to be we're going to superimpose some ideas over it, and etc., etc. So then you might ask, how can we move forward at all in this situation? And I think that's why when you look at Agamben, you think here's a master thinker, because he's negotiating it to some extent, even with these great difficulties, as Heidegger has shown is possible.